The learning objectives were to be identify firewall and network security management best practices. During this, the key concepts of firewall management best practices, threat and exploit mitigation, tools for managing and monitoring a firewall, and then we're also going to cover some tools for testing and troubleshooting a firewall. So let's talk about our best practices for a firewall. The best practices really start with a plan. Okay. Um, and that plan has to set on a foundation. Okay. So how do we create a plan? Well, it comes down to having a good framework. The framework is established when you are creating a policy. So the policy should outline, the overall objectives of what your firewall is going to do and the requirements for that. So the firewall will do, uh, control ingress and egress of any internet connectivity to the internet, to or from, business partners, to or from VPN clients or whatever. You're going to kind of list these out. Uh, your firewall policy is going to have an outline of basically what can be allowed through the firewall, what should not be allowed through the firewall, and that kind of stuff for that. So then you're going to have your plan, and based on your policy, you're going to have to know a few other things. So as you start to formulate your plan, you need to understand your infrastructures in your enterprise. So the infrastructure are the different components, the data centers, the servers, the functions of what these servers are doing, the network flows, the network traffics, and all that. And that should be part of your plan for creating a firewall management plan. After you have a good plan for implementation based on this, whether you're going to, determine this, you're going to have to perform a risk assessment, and that risk assessment will help you adjust that plan to account for ways in which you're going to have to do mitigations for things like business continuity, failover, and other things like that. And then once you're done with all of that, and you get your firewall implemented, you go back and review the policy. Because people are going to say, "Whoa, I need this, I need that." And that's times where you're going to either enforce the policy or you're going to make allowances in the policy and modify it. Say, oh, you know what? We totally neglected thinking that, our finance department needs to connect to financial institutions through the firewall, yada yada. And all financial institutions may be blocked or something. So then you could come back in there and add that to the policy and say, yes, we need to create that in the firewall policy. Modify your plans to do an implementation and modification of that plan. And then you do that, and then you can implement the changes to your policy. And then you start over again and you review it on probably an annual basis. There should also be a no exceptions policy. No exceptions policy is kind of a misnomer, but this is the thing when no exceptions means not even the CEO or president of the company can override the policy. Okay, this is your fail-safe for the enforcement. Just because this is where a lot of times you find a lot of bullying come into place, and I can't really implement allowing you to go to all these sports betting sites. We have a thing, and the guy may come, well, I'm the senior vice president of da 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 da, and you better, well, sorry, sir, this is policy. If you need to have it, make sure you get the policy changed at that point. Until that policy is allowing that type of information to go through, you do not, you have to follow the policy and the rules for that. That's what we kind of mean by the no exception policy here. Then you need to also focus on a philosophy of default deny rather than default allow. So the bottom rule of your firewall policy itself. Well, here we're talking about the actual policies that go on the firewall versus the other policies, which we were talking about, which are kind of like governance policies for that. And that's the no exception rule is a governance policy. Here we're talking about the default deny rule in an actual policy that gets applied to a firewall. And so you want to have a only allow by exception. In this case, contrary to the no exception policy there, in the firewall policy, anything other than a default deny rule is a rule that has an allowance, and that can be termed as a allow by exception type of firewall rule for that. So everything you want to do has, when you're creating firewall rules, should kind of limit and filter that connectivity as part of that firewall rule. You also want to maintain physical security. That means data center should, or wherever you're going to put your firewall, you should have restricted access to that firewall. It should be under a physical lock and key. It should also have a physical barrier to entrance to the room that is audited and controlled and all that. So you want to create a lot of physical locks to get into a system, to make sure you have no unauthorized access to go in there and like connect to the console directly. Because if you have physical access, uh, as I say in hackers world, it's game over. You also want to use that defense in depth thing policy. It's a philosophy where you have multiple layers. Like, as they say, Shrek is like an onion, and onions have layers. Well, your firewall and your defenses are going to have layers in it also. Uh, DMZs usually incorporate multiple firewalls involved in them. There's also a multitude of other items out there, such as IDS, IPS, uh, anti-malware, inline scanning, DLP, uh, host firewalls, anti-malware on those host firewalls, etc. This is the concept of defense in depth, and allowing that to maintain multiple systems to filter and control access for security. All right, some other best practices are to configure the firewalls to allow IP protocols like IPsec, VPNs, and other encryption to go through them, so you can protect your VPN systems. And that way, only the traffic going through a VPN passes through a firewall, so you can do this. The golden rule of any kind of firewall deployment or any kind of security implementation is the KISS method. Keep it simple, or keep it securely simple. You know, it's the easier it is, the easier, closer to follow, the more it can be followed. Simple processes, simple understanding is really important. I think this is something that has to be written, but it's the common sense. You need to prioritize. What is the most important thing out there in terms of your business need? You have to prioritize, different things in your life and in your work. So once you prioritize all of these things and you get that focus, you can then see how to attack things on going by the most important thing, or sometimes it might be your boss telling you what's the most important thing to do. So these are things that are priorities, and you need to, like in firewall policy, you want to put the most important rules at the top so that they can be processed first and allowed. The rules that get utilized the most should go at the top of the policy. you can organize it that way so the lesser used rules are more there at the bottom, where like if you have a rule that gets used maybe once every year for a report to be run, that can go near the bottom of the stack. While say you publish in your corporate website or your company's email, those could probably go at the top of the policy there. Um, you also want to make sure you harden both the internal firewall hosts and border firewalls. This means not opening up excess ports on them, not opening management ports to them. Uh, Make sure that they have no administrative access open to other systems. What I like to do is set up what I call a bastion host to monitor and manage my firewalls at console that I have to terminal server into that has limited access to that system from a subset of systems there. So it's really hard to get to the system that manages it. It's basically a terminal server, as we talked about earlier, or an HVD that has multiple users that can connect to it to run the firewall management software on it. And those can be used to do like live monitoring. I'm not talking about monitoring where you're sending your logs to a SIM. I'm talking about if you have to do like, uh, you know, actual monitoring of stuff going on the firewall performance or something like that. In a live state, you can do that from like a bastion host firewall. And this is a way to limit and control access to that firewall management console. You also want to be careful when you test new code on a firewall. A lot of firewalls will have a validate function for a policy, and this is where you'll go in there and it'll simulate putting the policy in place, and it runs tests to see if there's any kind of conflicts. If there are conflicts, it would cause a code error, and you need to go fix your policy code when you're writing that. And not to scare you, it's not a lot of you're not writing in Python or C or anything like that. Most of them are rules that are created through a management GUI interface or through a web UI, which you just kind of fill in the blanks. On the back end, the code is actually generated for that policy by the management console. But you want to make sure you can test that out before you do it. Same goes for testing out hotfixes. You want to install a hotfix or a patch on a test firewall to make sure it doesn't cause the system to crash or anything. And your test environment should emulate your production environment. The golden rule of all IT is backup, backup, and backup. So you want to do that. Always perform some prudent backups to a lot of your connections, or not your connections, to your configurations rather. Make sure they all get backed up. Once you do implement any kind of change on your firewall, you kind of want to lock the system down and kind of monitor it for a while. This is why in most places firewall rules are maybe applied only twice a week for any adjustments. That way you can have a watch and wait period for a couple of days to see if there's anything odd happening to the firewall or something weird goes on. You have that state where you can kind of monitor it and observe to see if there's any kind of adverse reactions to any new rules that were recently changed. Always maintain a incident response plan. Make sure the incident response plan is posted somewhere on the internet for your staff to utilize when necessary. It should include checklists. It should include step-by-step procedures. It should include information on who to call for help, who to escalate to, who to engage at the vendor if necessary, in case of something goes wrong, and how to contact those folks. The plan should also be written down and printed out somewhere in case there's a system crash or something and the online material does not become available. There should always be a written copy somewhere available to be utilized if necessary. And remember, the key to really working in a business is to focus on balancing security and usability. All right. It is really important to understand that you know you can't say no to everything in security. Security always used to be known as the Department of No, and so people will just hate security and they always try and go around it in cybersecurity, avoid it, create their own connections into and out, bypassing these through shadow IT and all these things, which was bad because it introduced a lot of vulnerabilities and a lot of bad things, you know, happened and potentially could have happened. So what we want to do is make sure that you want to have reasonable things. Don't say yes to every request. Only say yes to reasonable requests that seem to make the business function. And sometimes it might need to be where, um, in the course of business, I've asked for you know, a reason statement of why this needs to be, a business use case statement of why this needs to occur, so I can make a rational decision on whether this should go or not. So that's sometimes we need to do that as management to get that to work. All right. Um, for firewall management, you should always have a checklist. I mentioned that earlier in the incident response plan. The checklist is the things to do in case something goes wrong. Things to do if you're implementing a firewall rule. You should have a checklist. You know, if you ever go on an airplane, the pilots always go through their checklists to make sure everything is right, just for sanity purposes. Many times I have had to go into a firewall, and as I'm going down my checklist, I noticed a couple of steps might have been skipped. And this is where I have to do cleanup. Because a lot of times I would say, oh, okay, you decided to implement the rule and install it into the policy, but no validation was done. And if I check it and I find the rule errors and go through the logs, I find those validation errors. I can see installed no validation. And so you can see that sometimes that a couple of steps were skipped in the implementation of something. So a lot of these things you need to kind of do. If you have a checklist for installing a patch and all these things were done, like, hey, I validated the checksum of the file that we downloaded, and a lot of times I'll see that the file was downloaded didn't match the checksum, which meant we had a we had a corrupted download, which used to happen quite frequently in the old days. So we'd check the hash value of the checksum of the file, and then, oh, look at this, the checksums don't match. That's why this patch did not install. I re-download it, transfer it over, run the checksums again, and validate they matched. We install it, poof, it worked. So a lot of times we see stuff like that that can come from a checklist that need to be done. A lot of times people like to shortcut those, but it's best to follow those. Um, you do want to do a test of all the uses of the firewall for sufficiency. So uh, make sure that all the different components that you're going to be utilizing are working. Just don't say, okay, here we're going to have some allow rules there. Eventually, you might need to have some NAT rules. And a lot of times when you're doing NAT rules in a firewall, you'll notice that, these rules don't actually work because we may have some interface off, or we may have IP conflicts on the network with the NAT we're going to be utilizing. So you may want to make sure that all of these get tested out before usage. You want to perform regular vulnerability assessments on your firewall, especially against your management console from internal or external. Uh, you want to also try and run some other things. Nmap, utilizing stuff like Firewalk, is great for doing that. It'll do some scanning of your port. You can use like other things like Nessus or Qualys to scan your firewalls too to see if you can find anything wrong with them. Make sure you do the vulnerability assessment of your firewalls during times in which there is a downtime or a maintenance window or something, or a vulnerability test window where you have that scheduled downtime against them. Especially you may have to fail over your production to another system and make this like a warm system for that testing. You can do that. And then also perform penetration testing on them. And this is where you hire either a internal hacker or an external hacker to run some tests, see if they can actually hack into it. And they'll run the simulation for that to get you through that. All right. So, security measures in addition to a firewall. Well, you have your firewall, as you can see here in this little picture. It is just a piece of the puzzle. We have NAT, we have storage encryption, anti-malware, logging, VPN, network access control, the NAC, multi-factor authentication, and then IDS, IPS. All of these are parts of a security puzzle. All right, so mitigating firewall threats and exploits. So what we have are the logic controlling mechanisms in software or host firewall appliance. Remember, all of these can be have bugs in them. Bugs can be exploited. Bugs can be used to gain unauthorized access to systems. Hackers, they use scanning, testing, probing tools to discover exploitable weaknesses. An exploit is a vulnerability that is used to gain unauthorized access. Exploits can be used to bring down a firewall, make it crash. It can also give the hacker the ability to read or even monitor firewall rules in some instances. Vendors always release patches and updates to correct the problems. Always do that. A lot of people say avoid using the first generation or first release of a firewall product. Yes and no. I think in modern days it's getting less and less of that. So it's always a good practice to kind of wait till like the .1 release comes through, or the first service pack maybe for them. A lot of times people wait for that. Let other people work the bugs out, the early adapters. So one thing you want to do after installing a firewall, first time you quickly install all the patches and updates from the vendor. Always test updates first and then test them as quickly as possible. Only install the final releases of the firewall patch, and don't test alpha or beta pre-release test build on production firewalls. Always do that on non-production firewalls. When I worked for a firewall vendor, some of my clients had labs, and they would always ask for early advances, and we got them pre-release versions, and they would love to test them out for us. But they never installed them on prod except for one time, and that was an accident where they installed a pre-release version that had a bug in it, and they were wondering why it was causing their production system to crash. We found out. I looked at the version of it during a debug, and we found out it was the wrong version. Once we provided the correct version to them, they were up and running and very happy to get back into production and put that incident behind them. So there's a technique called firewalking. Firewalking is used with Nmap. It's a probing technique that can be used to potentially discover some new or all 9 or some new rules or rules on a firewall. Uh, what it does, it uses the TCP timeout values to determine if there are rules that exist on firewalls. They can do that. There's also the use of overlapping, and this can kind of cause full or partial overriding of datagram packets. We're going to have a diagram of this in a second, but it creates new datagrams out of previous datagram packets where they have a sequence number, and the sequence numbers overlap, and they can create kind of really large datagrams that way. And when you're constructing packets, and it can kind of do stuff um, that the firewalls don't like, and they crash or send weird responses saying, "Hey, these are illegal packets. I'm not passing them through to my host or something." They give out some weird errors at times, and that can give the hackers clue of what's out there. Then you have other types where fragment packets are sent, and you break up a normal packet, and they have a maximum transmission unit size, and they kind of just make them the smallest packets ever, and just kind of flood a firewall. It kind of is like a denial of service attack. It's kind of a flooding attack, really, where a flood of packets in there, and each packet has to be validated and processed for it to work. And so this causes a firewall to just the CPU and rules get overburdened, and there's a lot of CPU processing that kind of overflows. Okay, so here we look at fragmentation. So a normal packet, you have your IP header, TCP header. The data is too much for maximum transmission unit right there. So it gets broken up into two packets, same IP header there, and it's just a continuation of that. So if you ever look at Wireshark and a trace, you'll see this kind of packet there, and it's normal. Now here we have overlapping, where you have the data set. The data has an overlapped section of it. So what happens is, as it goes through, the data, two normal looking packets, where you have that split where it gets dropped off, can end up having some malicious data in it. And it could have an IP header discarded, and you could send something surreptitiously to your target by utilizing this method. And then overlapping IP header and data sections where you're sending basically almost the same thing every time, and that's kind of a flooding type of situation. So what you want to do when mitigating these threats, fragmentation, it's normal, it's fully supported. Packets fragment when they have a system that has to only accept a smaller maximum transmission unit, and then the packets, when they get reassembled, usually the return data is back to its original configuration. Now when they do the overlapping, they can kind of use that offset to cause a reassembly overlap, and then you got to use some kind of dynamic filtering system that performs a virtual reassembly. This virtual reassembly and many of the systems are done in a sandbox where they evaluate it and then they kind of scan it for malware. So we have that going on in a lot of places. There's also internal code planting, and this is kind of a method for exploiting or bypassing a firewall. So that can be done as a method for that. And then you have the firewall vulnerability to DOS flooding. And the one limitation or weakness you cannot fix or improve is how much traffic is hitting your firewall. You have to be cautious and aware of how much can go through it at one time. And there are some things out there like CDNs that can reduce the traffic hitting your firewall by using distributed networks out there through companies like Akamai or Cloudflare. Some of the concerns related to tunneling through or across the firewall. One of the things is hacker tunneling. A method is to install a component like a Trojan on a internal system, and then have that external client, send something which triggers the internal client to make an outbound connection to those, and then therefore the firewall will allow the connection to go through. It's kind of like a remote shell, and that's the second method I kind of went through. The first method is to install a component on the internal system, and you know, then external client connects the system. Uh, you know, it then kind of initiates like a terminal server where you kind of are tunneling through a web thing, and you can kind of keep making the same connection from external using the same firewall rule, using traffic that would normally be accepted by the server, but you're now allowing that server to go in. The second method is to install a server component on the external system, and then also require an internal client to initiate the connection, like a remote shell or a remote VPN or something on there, where you trigger the internal client to make its outbound connection, and you just kind of set up that tunneling to hijack that existing port to go through and utilize that. All right, so okay, so here's what it's going to look like if we see a VPN tunnel that is occurring through the firewall. As you can see, the internet, any client on the internet is able to create that little pipe tunnel that goes through to your internal server into or out of the firewall. The firewall has a rule that allows it. Uh, it can be used for legitimate reasons. It can also be used for other methods such as remote shell or remote targeting from hackers that set up other firewalls within your network. So now, what are our concerns related to tunneling through or across a firewall? So we've already established we need to have the default deny rule stance, and that should limit both inbound and outbound connections to anything but those endpoints that are explicitly allowed. What I mean by endpoint is who you designate to be the source or destination of that rule through that tunnel. So those should be explicitly defined on who can create a VPN tunnel to or through a firewall. Now, if the firewall allows outbound connections, uh, internally initiated connections are extremely easy to establish. So these are things you kind of want to watch out for. If there's not a legitimate reason for one, you want to be careful because a lot of times hackers will use those tunnels to exfiltrate data through the firewall without being noticed. The tunnels can use almost any kind of protocol, IP, ICMP, TCP, UDP, and any kind of application protocol. They can masquerade as almost anything. Special tunneling server client applications usually replace the traditional payload content, and they can do with whatever the hacker wishes. So you can modify an ICMP packet, like a ping, to have some data in it. And if you're not really paying close attention to your firewall, and you see a client sending, uh, you know, millions of pings in a day to one IP address on the internet, you might gonna get suspicious. So they try and hide it through other things, like through web data or something like that. Um, Now, the tunneling problem gets worse when there's actually encryption, so you can't see the contents of what's going through there. A lot of times, HTTPS traffic is utilized for tunneling nowadays because we don't really have a firewall that can do that inspection of it. Uh, Especially if there's anything like MTLS or something that needs to be enabled, that gets broken up real bad and so won't be utilized for legitimate applications. So, um, what can happen then is you need to just kind of set up some kind of proxy and filter that can do that kind of man-in-the-middle attack to inspect that traffic for like HTTPS traffic for that matter, or something for encryption to go that way too. Um, the tunneling setup using inbound connections uh, must kind of be a hijack. So if they're allowing stuff to come inbound to be put in, it's usually like a hijacked HTTPS session or an SMTP session. Or more likely you're going to see those uh, hijack sessions occur. Um, an existing open port can reconfigure to open up another port for another tunnel. So it's easy to use tunnels out there. Like if you have a ephemeral port, you're connecting in, and it says okay, source destination. You can also add secondary ports for complex protocols like RPC or something. Secondary channels and DNS a lot of times are also used for that purposes of exfiltrating data for that matter. All right, so concerns related to tunneling across a firewall. These are some systems like Loki can be used for monitoring firewalls. Netcat, CryptCat, NetBus are out there. They can kind of do some kind of Netcat can do vulnerability scanning. CryptCat can do monitoring of encryption configurations to and from the system, see what you're taking. NetBus is a scanning tool that allows a tunnel to occur through there. Back Orifice is a set of hacker tools that can be used out there. Sub7 is very similar to NetBus. It was originally uh, Sub 10, but they changed it to Sub 7 because it was NetBus spelled backwards, and they just kind of translate it. It's another scanning vulnerability tunnel tool that's out there. Tor is the Onion Router Network. You have VPNs that are like, quote, for academic purposes only, like Packety X VPN or Janus VM. Then you have the Hotspot Shield, uh, which is used for like wireless access. You'll find used to find that in places where there was open Wi-Fi. HTTP proxy is another tool that can be used for uh, putting your stuff on your laptop. A lot of times it was a Firefox plugin or Internet Explorer plugin. Was a lot of HTTP proxy was used for that. Uh, Concerns when related to tunneling through or across the firewall. Uh, as I stated earlier, the best defense against tunneling exploits is strictly enforce the deny by default for both inbound and outbound connections. Don't let new connections be established without, your authorization. Make sure an acceptable use policy clearly define which tools are unauthorized and which tools are considered security breaches. Um, I kind of think there's so many tools out there that come out daily. It's hard to keep a listing of everything unauthorized. It's better to create an inventory actually of tools that you are allowing on your network that have gone through compliance and validation, and checks would say these are the tools that are allowed on there. And if somebody wants to board a non-tool, it has to go through some kind of acceptable use requirement policy where it has to be approved by a number of different aspects, security and other IT out there for that. You want to test your firewall security, of course. So testing, you want to make sure you have the proper configuration for posture. You want to make sure you have good performance and strength against attacks and exploits. A lot of times people will install a firewall, they fail to test it. It's kind of a breach of best practice, and it kind of can leave the network vulnerable. There's a video out there that I saw recently. And this guy goes, "Well, I I go out physically install it on a location, and then I plug all the wires in, and I create it open, so now I can see what firewall rules I need to make, what goes through the firewall, and I just VPN into it to monitor it remotely." I was thinking, well, you're seeing all the things that are going to and through that firewall, and you're going to make your rules based on that. What's the problem there, folks? Well, if there was already an intruder there, he's probably just going to create a rule that's going to allow that intruder to keep going through that firewall. And I'm like, okay, well, you're seeing all the traffic that's going through your firewall. You're doing monitoring. You probably have a great little spreadsheet, and you can create some great rules off of that. But what if there is that malicious traffic that's already going through there? You're going to keep the status quo and allow that bad traffic to keep going through there. It's better to have kind of a plan where you're kind of controlling the network segments. You understand that business infrastructure, that corporate infrastructure you have, and understand actually what is supposed to be going to and from that firewall. Can't fault the guy. I've been in that situation before where I had to replace a firewall, and nobody had any clue of what their applications did or what ports they used or whatever, because, quote, that was installed before my time, et cetera, et cetera. And management said, you know what, we don't want to have everything black because we don't want anything to go down. So I feel for you, but my situation, it was an internal firewall connecting two different internal sites. So I didn't put up too much of that. I just kind of said, okay, well, it's internal to internal, just between two different areas. So I'm okay with keeping to do that for now till I find out the firewalls, and I'll monitor it, structure it, and then make queries to see who owns the sources. And I did my due diligence that way and find out what they needed. You also want to do things like your simulator firewall test. This is kind of like where you could kind of use something like Load Runner or something to transmit packets to the firewall and see what it does. You can do virtual firewall tests. This is where you set up a bastion host setup on the outside, and you use it to see, what virtual external systems become active, from that, to just kind of see what it's like on the outside. And you just kind of work through different attack scenarios out there. There's a number of attack scenarios. You can do some research on the internet. A lot of folks will put their scripts on GitHub out there on how to do a virtual firewall test out there for that. So you can do that. And then you can do lab tests, of course. And you just kind of nail your firewalls hard in the non-reproduction sections of your network. So you can test them and validate them out there. A lot of good tools to use. That Nmap was one of them I said to use. NetMap can be used in addition with Firewalk. You can get that out there. Some scripts from Firewalk to test, firewall rules, see what's out there. You can see if you can determine what your firewall rules are that way. You can use Netstat, TCPview, FPROT, Snort, Nessus, Wireshark, CapCat, CryptCat, Netcat, yeah, Syslog. A lot of these out there with Kali Linux and stuff like that to just kind of use that to kind of monitor the fire. Syslog's for monitoring. CryptCat can check your crypto algorithms on your firewall, which ones allow connections onto it. Uh, uh, Snort, Wireshark, Netcat. All these can be used to kind of check to see what's available. TCP view, system tool that can kind of show you what TCP connections are out there. A lot of cool tools you can investigate, and these are some of them. Nessus is a vulnerability scanner tool. You can use those for that. If you ever use Wireshark, it's a great tool to have. Everyone should have that installed. It is something that is great for just reviewing your network packets and reviewing traces. So we believe we have a lab that covers this. You should be able to do that really easily. Now, if you ever have to do some firewall troubleshooting, uh, these can be done with make sure you have a good inventory of your hardware and software relative to your firewalls. You want to make sure you have electronic and paper copies of your configuration settings, i.e. print them out after you're done. You want to make sure you have a good firewall policy and make sure you have a good backup of your firewall policy. You want to have your change documentation, whether if it's done electronically through some change control management system or if it's done in email, you want to make sure that those logs are there. You want to review that in case something goes wrong, because if something does go wrong, the first question I ask is, what changed? And everybody's going to say nothing. So that's when you go back and look at the change documentation to see what changes have occurred. And you can kind of go back, and that gives you a clue of where to start. You can also look at previous troubleshooting logs from what people have done in the past or others are doing right now to troubleshoot the situation. You can look at your activity, error, and alert logs for the systems, so you can see what's going on with that. You want to check your maintenance logs out there. The maintenance logs will provide you information on what also has changed out there. You also want to look at the physical and logical network topologies to see if maybe, something on the other side of your firewall might have gone wrong. A lot of times we've seen, the firewall is not responding. When in truth, it turns out that the switch port had not been responding, or something weird happened to that. The switch died, or router died, or somebody ran a script on the router, and they edited out the route to or from the firewall by accident. Seen that happen. And then you kind of want to gather any other information about the current problem, when it happened, who saw it, what they were doing. I've actually had an incident where, the firewall is the problem. They called me in, and I looked at it, and I'm like, okay, tell me about the thing. Well, this such came in the laptop. I'm like, okay, let's look at the basics on that laptop, just so I could get an idea. And turns out they had hard-coded their IP address to their home network. And they gave their internal network the same range of IP addresses as their work subnet, but it had a different default gateway. So, quote, the firewall wasn't working because they were sending their packets out the wrong route. And of course, the firewall never saw the traffic. So once we changed their gateway, everything worked. Thank you for fixing the firewall. So, yeah. When you're troubleshooting, have patience. Kind of know your firewall thoroughly, help isolate the problem, keep it simple, do simple steps, make simple modifications, focus on it when you're doing your test, kind of just keep it in perspective, but simple questions, and kind of help isolate the problem. You always want to review that change documentation again. You always review those previous troubleshooting logs. Always make sure you're updating your troubleshooting log with the steps you're doing. Uh, Go for the low-hanging fruit. Try the basic stuff, the quick and easy fixes first. Um, Always avoid the destructive solutions like, all right, I'm deleting the whole policy and starting over again. You want to stop doing that. You want to just do something there. Uh, Try free options before you're doing the ones, like maybe reinstall policy or something like that. Um, Look at your logs. That's a free kind of thing to do. Costly ones are rebuilding your firewall from scratch because that takes time. Always make one fix at a time. Make one fix, test, see if that worked. Um, you can either revert that fix, revert that change to go back to what it was. Then you try something else, test, see if it works, go revert it back. Don't change like 20 things because someone's going to ask you, what fixed it? You're going to have an idea. So, test after each attempt, reverse or undo the solution failures, keep repeating it, and then always do that post-mortem review where you write down what fixed it and what the problem was. So here's kind of a flow chart of doing that. Uh, in case there's something going on, you want to make sure everyone's prepared for when it does happen, because it will happen. So you train your security incident response team, and you allocate the resources for that. If there is a breach, you have to detect that actual breach. The next step is containment. So you kind of make sure that the breach doesn't get any further than what it has. What you do is then eradicate the problem and resolve the compromise by kicking the hacker out, blocking that hacker, put some in there to do that. If it's a virus, you kind of look to take those systems offline, quarantine them or something. In that containment feature, during that time, you can either rebuild those systems, which eradicates it, or have specialized software designed to remove that uh, function there. Then you kind of want to like bring it back to normal, reintroduce it, uh, you know, have that happen that way. And then you kind of want to follow up the process and help improve the future responses. So, in summary, we've talked about firewall management best practices, the firewall threat and exploit mitigation, tools for managing and monitoring a firewall, firewall testing and troubleshooting. And if you have stayed this far and listened to all of this, a bonus to you will be if you send me an email, bcrow@colin.edu, I will send you a review of all the questions asked on the firewall. So this way, I'm not giving you the answers, but it's going to be a list of all the questions that are going to be asked, and you could utilize that to study and help create a focus study. It's quite a large list of all the questions from the bank, but at least you'll be prepared to answer them, and you should be able to do good with that. So good luck. Next week is your final, and I hope you do great. Thanks.